For a brief moment, inside a crowded ballroom, time slowed to something almost unreal. Hundreds of people were seated shoulder to shoulder, listening, waiting, unaware that history had already entered the room. In that instant, two men understood exactly what was about to happen: Malcolm X on the stage, and Bumpy Johnson standing just far enough away to see everything clearly. No signal was given. No warning announced itself. What followed would unfold in seconds, but the consequences would last generations. When the attack began, confusion ripped through the room. People stood, turned, froze. In moments like that, chaos usually decides everything. But chaos didn't win here. Control did not the kind that comes from authority or law, but the kind born from instinct, restraint, and a brutal understanding of consequence. Someone had seconds to escape. The question wasn't whether he could run. It was whether anyone would allow him to. This is not a story about stopping a killing. That chance passed too quickly. This is a story about what came immediately after the narrow window where decisions still mattered, where one choice could turn murder into martyrdom or accountability into legend. In those 30 seconds, violence was no longer the point. Meaning was. Bumpy Johnson had lived his entire life solving problems with speed and finality. But this moment demanded something different. Every action carried weight beyond the room. The future of a movement, the legacy of a man who chose conviction over safety, and the line between justice and vengeance. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It was controlled, deliberate, and irreversible. A decision made under pressure that ensured one thing above all else: the truth of that day would not disappear with a running man. Because sometimes, the most important part of history happens after the shot, in the seconds when escape seems possible, and someone decides it won't be. 3 days before the ballroom filled with people, before history narrowed into seconds, a line had already been drawn. Not in public, not on a stage, but in the quiet aftermath of an attack meant to send a warning. Fire had torn through Malcolm X's home, forcing his family into the cold night with nothing but what they could carry. The message behind it was unmistakable: silence or death. That was when Bumpy Johnson stepped in, not as a spectator and not as a symbol of the streets, but as someone who understood exactly how these warnings escalated. He didn't come with speeches or condolences. He came with an offer built on certainty. Time could be bought. Threats could be neutralized. Violence could be met with greater violence, fast enough to make the problem disappear. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was the correct move. Remove the danger before it reached a crowd. End the chain before it produced a body. That was the logic Bumpy had lived by for decades, and it had kept him alive in a world that rarely forgave hesitation. But Malcolm rejected it. Not out of ignorance, not out of pride, out of alignment. He understood what accepting that protection would mean. It wouldn't just save his life, it would rewrite his message. A man who preached discipline, dignity, and moral responsibility couldn't survive behind armed shadows without undermining everything he stood for. To live that way would turn him into a contradiction his enemies could exploit forever. That refusal reshaped everything that followed. Once Malcolm chose principle over safety, the outcome was no longer a question of if, it was a question of how. Bumpy understood that too. Respect didn't mean agreement, it meant acceptance. From that moment on, his role changed. He wasn't there to prevent fate. He was there to manage what happened when fate arrived. That's what makes the ballroom moment impossible to reduce to instinct or reaction. The choice wasn't made in 30 seconds. It was made days earlier, in the quiet space where survival was offered and declined. By the time the room filled with people, the path was already narrow. And when history compresses like that, every step matters. To understand what followed, you have to understand why protection was never an option. For Malcolm X, survival had meaning only if it didn't hollow out the message he carried. Accepting armed protection from the underworld would have kept him breathing, but it would have reframed everything he said afterward. His critics wouldn't need to debate his ideas. They would point to the shadows behind him and call the argument settled. That calculation mattered more than fear. Malcolm wasn't naive about danger. He understood exactly how real it was and how close it had moved. But his authority came from moral clarity, not force. Once that clarity blurred, his voice would become just another weapon in someone else's hand. Living that way would have turned every speech into a contradiction, a man denouncing violence while depending on it. For Bumpy Johnson, this refusal was hard to accept, but impossible to dismiss. He had built his life on decisive action, on stopping threats before they matured. In his world, protection wasn't hypocrisy, it was responsibility. But he also recognized conviction when he saw it. Malcolm wasn't rejecting help to appear brave. He was protecting the integrity of his cause, even if it meant placing himself directly in harm's way. That choice reshaped the nature of responsibility. Once protection was refused, the goal was no longer prevention at any cost. It became containment. If the worst happened, it had to happen without collateral damage, without turning a political assassination into a bloodbath that would swallow the very people Malcolm spoke for. This is the line most retellings miss. Malcolm didn't choose death. He chose coherence. He chose to stand in public without armor, knowing exactly what that implied. And in doing so, he forced everyone around him into a narrower set of options. Bumpy understood that too. If he intervened too early, he would become part of the story Malcolm was trying to avoid. If he intervened too late, he would carry the weight of having done nothing. The space left to him was brutally small. By rejecting protection, Malcolm wasn't removing agency from others. He was redefining it. He was saying, if this ends, let it end without distortion. Let the truth of what happened remain intact. That decision didn't make the danger disappear. It made every second that followed heavier. The ballroom wasn't just a venue. It was a moral boundary. Families filled the rows. Children shifted in their seats. Elders leaned forward to listen. This wasn't a battlefield, and everyone in the room felt that distinction, even if they couldn't articulate it. Violence here would never stay contained. Whatever happened would echo outward, attaching itself to every face present. That's why Bumpy Johnson read the space before anything else. Not the exits alone, not the aisles alone, but the density of bodies, the angles of sight, the way panic would move if it started. Public spaces impose a tax on force. Every action multiplies risk. Every reaction creates variables no one can fully control. On stage, Malcolm X stood unguarded, precisely because guards would have changed the meaning of the moment. The crowd wasn't a shield, it was the point. He had chosen visibility over safety, knowing that the same openness that gave his words power also made him vulnerable. In that choice, the room became sacred ground, not because it was safe, but because it demanded restraint. Bumpy understood the paradox immediately. If violence erupted, it wouldn't just be an attack on a man. It would be an attack on the idea that this space could remain civic, shared, and human. The difference between stopping a threat and poisoning a room is thin, and it's measured in seconds. Pull too soon and the panic becomes the story. Pull too late and the loss becomes irreversible. That's why the moments before the attack mattered more than the attack itself. The air tightened, attention narrowed. People sensed a shift without knowing why. In that compression of time, the ballroom imposed its own rules. It said, whatever you do next will be judged not by intent, but by consequence. This is where many stories collapse into action beats. But the truth lives in the pause, in the calculations made without words, in the awareness that the room itself had agency. It could be protected, or it could be shattered. There was no third option. When history is about to break, the environment becomes a participant. The ballroom wasn't passive. It constrained choices, elevated costs, and demanded a kind of discipline that can't be trained, only recognized. And in that recognition, the path forward narrowed to a single, unbearable line. When the moment finally arrived, it didn't feel sudden, it felt inevitable. Time compressed, not into chaos, but into a narrow corridor where every option was visible and every consequence unavoidable. In that corridor stood Bumpy Johnson, holding a decision most people never have to face, not whether he could act, but whether he should. From where he stood, the threat was clear. The intention was unmistakable. In another setting, the calculation would have been simple. But this wasn't a street corner or a back room. It was a crowded hall filled with families, elders, and children. A single act meant to stop one man could easily turn into harm for many others. In spaces like this, force doesn't travel in straight lines. It ricochets through panic, movement, and fear. That's when the final exchange happened, not spoken, not signaled, but understood. Malcolm X turned, not in surprise, but in recognition. He saw the position Bumpy was in. He saw the weight of what was being asked, without words ever being used. And in that instant, he chose consistency over survival. This is the part history rarely slows down enough to examine. Malcolm didn't appeal for rescue. He didn't plead for intervention. He affirmed the line he had drawn for himself long before that day. To live protected by violence would have undone everything he stood for. To die without betraying it would seal his message in a way no speech ever could. For Bumpy, that understanding froze action. Not out of fear, out of respect. To fire in that moment would have saved a life at the cost of another innocent one and at the cost of violating the very principle Malcolm was choosing to defend. Power, stripped of restraint, becomes noise. Power guided by restraint becomes burden. So the shot that could have been taken wasn't. This wasn't hesitation. It was discipline. The discipline to accept that some outcomes, once set in motion, cannot be rewritten without becoming something worse. In that fraction of time, Bumpy didn't fail to act. He acted by refusing to turn a moral line into collateral damage. History often rewards decisiveness, but occasionally it is defined by the refusal to act when action would corrupt meaning. That's what happened here. Not a missed opportunity, but a conscious surrender to a choice already made by the man on the stage. The moment passed, and with it, the last clean exit from tragedy. When the room exploded into motion, the window for prevention was gone, but the window for accountability was still open. Panic surged, people stood, screams cut through the air, and instinct took over. In moments like this, outcomes are usually decided by chaos. This time, they weren't. What followed was not pursuit fueled by rage, but containment driven by clarity. Bumpy Johnson understood something immediately. Firing a weapon now would only add another layer of tragedy. In a crowd this dense, force would multiply harm instead of stopping it. The priority had shifted. It was no longer about saving a life. It was about making sure the truth didn't disappear with a fleeing man. The attacker had seconds, not much more. In most public assassinations, that's all it takes. Confusion creates cover. Crowds create exits. History is left chasing shadows. But this room didn't dissolve into pure disorder. Movement narrowed. Paths closed. The chaos had edges, and within those edges, control reasserted itself. This is the part rarely understood about power in moments of crisis. It isn't about dominance. It's about direction, where people move, where they don't, which actions escalate, and which ones end the sequence. By refusing to turn the aftermath into a shootout, Bumpy kept the focus where it belonged on the man who had acted, not on a spectacle that would blur responsibility. The result was decisive without being theatrical. The attempt to escape collapsed under the weight of the room itself, not because everyone coordinated, but because the situation had been framed correctly. The killer wasn't allowed to become a ghost. He was forced to remain present, visible, and answerable. That distinction mattered enormously. A martyr vanishes into myth. A captured man leaves questions behind, questions that point upward, outward, and forward. By ensuring there was no clean escape, the narrative stopped being about fear and started being about consequence. In those 30 seconds, control didn't come from violence. It came from restraint applied at exactly the right moment. The attack had already taken a life. It didn't need to take the truth with it. And that is why the door never became an exit. History often remembers who fired first. It rarely lingers on who chose not to. Yet what defines this day isn't the speed of violence, but the discipline that followed it. In the narrow minutes after Malcolm X fell, the story could have fractured into chaos, myth, and disappearance. It didn't because someone understood that preserving meaning mattered more than satisfying instinct. Bumpy Johnson had lived in a world where decisive force solved problems quickly. But this moment demanded something rarer: restraint with consequences. By refusing to turn the aftermath into a spectacle, he kept the focus on accountability. Not vengeance, not noise, accountability. The difference determines whether truth survives or evaporates. Malcolm chose coherence over survival. He refused a life protected by shadows because it would have hollowed his message. That choice forced everyone around him into a smaller set of options, options measured not by courage, but by integrity. When the room broke into motion, the only victory left was to ensure the truth didn't run out the door. This is the part that doesn't fit neatly into headlines. Power isn't always the ability to end a life. Sometimes it's the ability to prevent a lie from escaping, to keep responsibility anchored when fear would rather scatter it, to accept the burden of not acting when action would corrupt the meaning of what was lost. Legacies are built as much by refusals as by deeds. Malcolm's by standing where he stood, Bumpy's by honoring that stand when it hurt the most. Between them lies a lesson that outlives the moment. Strength is not only what you can do under pressure, it's what you refuse to do when pressure begs you to. The door was there. Escape was possible. The truth stayed anyway.